Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cynthia Joseph Riccio, and I'm the Associate Director and Director of Visitor Engagement at the Webb Deane Stevens Museum. Thank you all for being here and helping us celebrate Women's History Month. Today, we are doing things a little differently, and I'll be in conversation with Anne Foley to talk about Amy Cogswell, designer of our Colonial Revival Garden. Amy Cogswell was one of the country's first female landscape architects. We'll talk about her vision, the history of the garden, and how today a team of dedicated volunteers assist in caring for this beloved community treasure. About our guest today, Anne Foley is the Garden Angels volunteer coordinator for the Webb Deane Stevens Museum, a role she's held for over 12 years. She leads a team of garden enthusiasts who assist head gardener Peter Winnie in caring for the museum's gardens. She is also a former guide for the museum and plans the Garden Angels annual reception and festivities for the annual Connecticut Historic Gardens Day. And she actively recruits new members and enjoys talking with visitors about her favorite plants in the garden, including the flowering almond, peonies, verbena, hostas, and sea holly. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you, Cindy. What a nice introduction. In 1921, Annie Burr Jennings, Standard Oil heiress and prominent Connecticut colonial dame, hired Amy Cogswell, principal of the Lothrop School for Women Landscape Architects, to design a colonial garden for the dame's newly purchased property here in Wethersfield. Amy designed and the dames installed a classic Colonial Revival Garden to complement the colonial Webb House and later the restored expanded barn. The dames and Amy worked on the installation from 1921 through 1923, and Amy came back to give advice on refreshing the garden when the rebuilt and redesigned barn was dedicated in 1931.
So, Anne, who was Amy Cogswell?
Amy Cogswell became a well-known landscape architect specializing in colonial gardens. While an excellent plantswoman, she also, to quote Master Gardener Rose Riley, created our garden with strong bones and a balance of hardscape and plantscape. She was born in Norwich, Connecticut in 1867. Her family was well-to-do, although not fabulously wealthy. She attended Norwich Free Academy, as did her sister Alice, but did not go on to college. Her brother Charles went to MIT and became a very successful civil engineer in Chicago. Amy and Alice lived at home, did not marry, and we assume kept house for her father after the early death of her mother. When her father died in 1912, I like to think that Amy was able to finally come into her own. She'd always been a plantswoman. It may have also been that her father did not leave enough of an estate for Amy and Alice to live in the style to which they had become accustomed. Amy may have needed to make a living. I like to suspect it was a little bit of both.
So can you tell us what was the Lothrop School where Amy was?
Before the World War I and leading up to World War II, women were not allowed to go to school in the major architectural schools such as MIT and Harvard. Some, like Beatrix Ferran, would therefore take grand tours of Europe, seeing the grand gardens and meeting with the famous landscape architects of the time, such as Gertrude Jekyll. But others, including Judith Lowe, established their own schools for women. She established the Lothrop School for Women Landscape Architects in 1901. It was no refuge for dilettante gardeners. The course was rigorous and required study in such topics as drainage and blueprint production. You will see the blueprint. As you can see from the gorgeous blueprints Amy produced, their standards were very high. After World War II, though, the male schools began admitting female students. Due to that and ongoing financial difficulties, all the women's schools merged or were taken over by the larger and longer established institutions. Lothrop became the landscape architecture department at Rhode Island School of Design. So in 1912, Amy enrolled in the Lothrop School. She was in her 40s. After graduating from Lothrop in 1916, she became its principal until retiring in 1923. She became a well-known expert in the 1920s and 30s on colonial gardens. We would, of course, refer to them as Colonial Revival Gardens. She worked with the Olmsted brothers, Fisk Kimball, the noted architect and architecture historian, Ellen Biddle Shipman at the Cornish Colony, and I suspect she may have worked with Beatrix Jones Ferran here in Connecticut. She designed a garden for the American wing of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which is now an interior space. She's also liked to take on the smaller house gardens. She designed one in Nantucket, where I've seen pictures of it. Looks like the bones of her garden are still there. She designed the garden here at the Webb House, and it's about the same time she was working on a garden for the Glebe House in Woodbury, Connecticut. Both were funded by Annie Burr Jennings. This last project was not installed, as Annie Burr Jennings, after having had tea with Gertrude Jekyll at her home in England, had convinced Miss Jekyll to design the garden. Miss Jekyll was sent Amy's plan. She then asked Miss Jennings why she would not use Amy's design, as it was quite excellent. Miss Jennings was not deterred, and a final design has been installed, I believe, in Woodbury.
Well, I've heard you tell the story of Amy and Jefferson's Monticello. Do you want to tell it again to all of our guests here?
Of course, it's a great story. Fisk Kimball, the irascible architecture historian and architect, had been chosen to lead the renovation of Monticello in the 1920s. Through his connections with the Olmsted brothers, he contacted Amy for help in installing the gardens. I want to note that this was before Jefferson's garden books were published in the 1950s. So Amy really had nothing to go on. So she immersed herself in trying to understand Jefferson. She read his writings and read books and histories of him. She traveled to Virginia, I believe staying in Charlottesville, and enlisting the aid of a former student. Amy didn't drive. However, she ran into the buzzsaw that was the Virginia Garden Club and its legendary president, Suzanne Massey. They wanted nothing to do with this irritatingly chirpy Yankee spinster, which is what I want on my tombstone, and blocked her efforts at reinstalling the garden. They also, it appears, wanted nothing to do with Fisk Kimball. That they resented that the foundation to restore Monticello, which had fallen into terrible disrepair and had even been used as a stable for cows, this new foundation was headquartered in New York City. Before I go on, I want to emphasize, though, that the Virginia Garden Club has done incredible work in saving the great gardens, the great plantation gardens throughout Virginia. These gardens all would have been lost without their efforts. So Amy packed up her plans and returned to Norwich, where she lived in the family home until she passed away in 1958 at the age of 91. The end of the story is that some 10 years later, when Amy was in her early 70s, Fisk Kimball tried to return to the project when Suzanne Massey retired. He wrote to Amy in Norwich, and she sent him the designs she had done years before. When he asked her to join him once again, she demurred, saying she thought the project was much better suited for a man. It wasn't until after the publication of Jefferson's Garden Journals in the 1950s that a true restoration could be undertaken. Basically completed in 2017, the gardens have been restored under the direction of Peter Hatch, Director of Grounds and Gardens for Monticello.
So we hear the term colonial revival quite often. Can you describe a colonial revival garden for us?
Colonial Revival Gardens were a reaction against the Victorian gardens of the late 19th century. And with their tightly planted beds of all one plant and all one color, the well-known Parterre Gardens. The colonial revival in society as a whole was a reaction to the social changes of the Industrial Revolution, with its waves of immigration and crowded, dirty cities. The Colonial Revival Garden was a piece of that colonial revival. It reflected the strong urge to return to a simpler time, to return to Grandma's garden. As in our garden, the Revival Garden often had a strong geometric base. Amy designed 4 squares, 4 quadrants, bordered by sharply edged gravel paths, centered on the door to the Webb House patio. Each square is comprised of a herbaceous border around a plot of grass, each planted in the center with an ornamental tree. She specified the choices redwood, dogwood, crabapple, and magnolia. The borders are densely planted with a wide variety of perennials, peonies, roses, hosta, and flowering perennials and annuals, bluebells, phlox, ageratum, heliotrope, petunias, even sedum. These were actually encouraged to spill over the edges of the border to soften the rigid geometry of the gravel paths. The plant choice reflected this return to simpler, more natural times and the belief in returning to the colonial era. In actuality, most of the plants were imports, with very few actually being native to the continent. You will recognize these plants in our garden. The plant choice is huge. Our plant list exceeds 100 different plants. One last point. Many gardens in this era were designed to be at peak when the family was in residence. A garden might be designed, for example, to be at its best in August down on the shore. Since the Webb House was open all year, Amy designed the garden to look at its best from late April through late October or November. While we all have our favorites in the garden and our favorite time in the garden, mine has to be late July when the hosta plantagenea comes into bloom.
So again, we get this question a lot. Is this the original garden?
No, gardens are ephemeral and often they go away when not kept up. Our garden is very labor intensive and probably drifted away during the Depression and labor shortages in World War II. Several different gardens were begun over the years after that, including gardens designed by Fletcher Steele, Adelma Grenier Simmons of Caperlands, and Mary Wells Edwards, who designed the reinstalled garden at Phelps Hathaway in Suffield. None of these gardens have survived.
So when was the garden as we know it today installed?
Well, late in the 1990s, the staff at the museum discovered the original blueprints drawn by Amy Cogswell, assisted by Elizabeth Greenleaf Patty, one of her students at Lowthorpe. A grant by the Stanley Horticultural Trust was secured, and we hired Sheila Wertheimer to design and oversee the installation of the garden.
So is the current garden historically accurate? We get that question
All the time.
All the time.
In spirit, yes. But a former addition to the museum, as well as a venerable and popular locust tree, which you can just see over our shoulders, required adjustments to the design. Changes to the Webb House continue to impact the garden. The newly opened Holcomb Center, which we are seated in at this time, specifically included in its design, making the garden an integral part of the space. We also note that the garden, when it was originally installed, was not installed exactly to the blueprints, and the adjustments were probably made by Amy herself. We know that certain features of the original design were not installed, including a half-moon garden at the foot of the garden and a garden shed with lilacs and roses over where the driveway is now. Another challenge in staying true to a historic garden design is that some of the specified plant material just is no longer available. To respond to this, we choose an available plant that is the same color, hopefully fragrance and habit. Another challenge is damage by pesky animals, such as our resident woodchucks.
Yes, we see them very frequently out here.
They love phlox for breakfast. Until we were able to reduce the population and protect the emerging plants, we depended on the cleome that had volunteered in the garden, probably coming in on the mulch. And in the future, we will need to adjust for climate change. We already have had an impact on our scheduling. We're open much later in the season, but we're eventually going to have to modify our plant choice.
So this reinstalled garden is now over 20 years old.
Yep.
How do you do it?
We are indeed very proud of the fact that the reinstalled garden has lasted this long. The critical factor of our success was the hiring of a master gardener to oversee the care of the garden in the person of Rose Riley, who has just retired. The museum replaced her with our new head gardener, Peter Winnie. But the garden is very labor intensive. To provide this labor, the museum established the Garden Angels, a group of volunteer garden enthusiasts who meet about once a month during the garden season to plant out annuals, weed obsessively, plant bulbs, and finally put the garden to bed in November under a warm bed of composted mulch. Our Saturday morning sessions, part work, part social, part seminars on all things horticultural, are supplemented by special pop-up sessions to tackle projects major and minor.
Okay, and now we will give you more information about this a little bit later, but are we trying to recruit new angels?
Why, yes, it really is a great opportunity to meet new people, make friendships, and learn about gardens, and take home cuttings, seeds, and thinnings. Some angels, brand new gardeners, and many others are veterans with a number of master gardeners in the mix.
Well, Anne, thank you so much.
Okay.
I'm going to look for some questions now, and I'm also going to let everybody know I did have some pictures to show you today. However, I lost them when we started our webinar, which just means that you will have to come and see the garden in person when it opens up. So our first question, was fragrance taken into consideration for the garden design?
Hi, Amy. I do believe that it was, because a lot of the design included the old roses, which of course are very fragrant. Many of the classic, we have sage in the garden, which of course, as you brush by it, you will smell it. The Hosta Plantagenea, which blooms in the late summer, has a very tall spire of white flowers, which are unusually for hostas, also fragrant.
And we have a comment here. Thank you so much, Anne and Cindy. On a chilly day like this, Anne Guernsey can't wait for spring flowers. Is anything peeking through? Also, what types of flowers will we see first? And I can say that there are a few things that are already.
Yes, we our bulbs are really beginning to come up, as are our iris. Their bearded iris are just poking up now. I believe within a week we will start to see some color in this garden, as I noticed some daffodil bulbs in the garden. Our first garden session is April 22nd, which is also Earth Day, and by that time we will have plenty of weeding to do.
And that's a plea for volunteers. What might one see in late April?
Oh dear, my favorite plant in the garden comes in first. It's up at the top of the steps, right near the patio, our flowering almond. And they are just, they don't last terribly long, but they are really quite beautiful. So come see the flowering almond. There's followed pretty quickly by the quince. We can also, a flowering quince, which is really an interesting plant. We can have the Virginia bluebells, I think, come up then. Our Johnny jump ups will be up soon. And so the garden begins to start looking really good, even in April.
And what are your favorite flowers in the garden?
I have my absolute favorite flower changes daily. It starts with the flowering almond, it ends with the Hosta Plantagenea. But in between we have that beautiful white lily. We have the peonies, which put on quite a show. We have a lot of the traditional annuals. We have alyssum and heliotrope. We have petunias. Most of the colors seem to be in the lavender, blue, and purple shades. But every once in a while you get a real pop of red or yellow to really wake you up and make you look.
How did you find out so much about Amy? Did she keep diaries, letters? Was the search difficult?
What a great question. As with so many other women professionals of this era, all of their papers were thrown away after they passed away. Beatrix Friend was one of the few who specifically in her will directed where her papers were to go. So it was a lot of sleuthing. We knew she lived in Norwich. We went back to the newspapers in Norwich and found mentions of things like she took first place in the New London Fair with her sweet peas. We did a lot of work on Ancestry.com, did a lot of work on her family and followed her family over the years. I discovered I knew nothing about the Colonial Revival, so I had to do a crash course in Colonial Revival. And there is quite a bit of information on other women landscape architects. And then a friend of mine, an email person, led me down to Monticello, where they had kept a lot of the correspondence between Amy and Fisk Kimball. And that really showed a side of Amy as a person. I've never been able to find a picture of Amy, so we don't know what she looks like.
So if any of you know where there might be a picture of him, please let us know.
Please, please, please.
Do you have any future wishes for the garden?
Oh, more volunteers. That would be wonderful. I have been really happy to see how the garden itself has been incorporated into the new addition here. And we're beginning to use the garden as a real asset to the museum. It's always been a asset for the weddings in the barn. One of the things that is kind of really intrigued me now is a question that Ann Guernsey raised to me about using the garden as a research tool, using it as a historic source, because there are plants in this garden which are not very common now in most other gardens. So that's kind of been, I'm going to obsess over that for a while.
And we do have one final question. Katie Sullivan is asking, how can people become volunteers? And funny you should ask that, Katie. If you are interested in joining the Garden Angels, please email volunteer@wdsmuseum.org, and we would be happy to have you come in and meet with us and volunteer. And on behalf of the museum and the NSCBA CT, thank you so much for joining us today for your for such a wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much for having me.
And if you enjoyed this program, please consider donating at wdsmuseum.org to help us continue to offer free and affordable community events. Thank you all for joining us today.